Hello, and welcome to English for Philosophy students. We are studying Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and we are in Rule 7. Last week, we had our 48th lesson in the overall book study and our first lesson in Rule 7. And now I would like to recap. And so today is lesson 49 because last week was 48. So now I want to recap last week and then move straight into the rest of continuing with the text. All right, let's see. So Rule 7 states that we should pursue, chase, try to get what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Expedient means maybe best for me, materially, practical. But meaningful has a more spiritual, less material value. So, the beginning of this chapter, the first few paragraphs, basically recap what we learned in the last rule, that life is hard, and some people may say that it is bad and sort of very bad, that the universe is tragic and that good people have to suffer and that everyone must die. And in such a terrible universe, the best thing you can do is commit suicide or murder and suicide. This was discussed at great length in the last rule or two. So he recaps all of this, and then he ends with a question. Let's read these last two little paragraphs right here. The pleasure of expediency may be fleeting, but it is pleasure nonetheless, and that's something to stack against the terror and pain of existence. Every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost, as the old proverb has it. Why not simply take everything you can get whenever the opportunity arises? Why not determine to live in this manner? Or, is there an alternative more powerful and more compelling? So this entire chapter is going to explore the question of whether that which is meaningful is worth living for and is worth giving up that which is expedient, that which gives me pleasure in the short run. So meaningful is a different kind of good than expediency. And he is going to talk about the whole concept of what it means for a good to be meaningful. It is not easy to define. As I sit here, I cannot think of a way to clearly define meaningful. And Jordan Peterson is going to go into pages and pages of discussion of what it means. Expedient is easy to define. It's just what will benefit you practically in the short run. No matter who you hurt or what the morality of the situation is. So let's see. So let us continue to read from the red, which we did read last time, but we will use this to get a little bit of a running start into today's. So I'll continue reading. Or is there an alternative, more powerful and more compelling? Our ancestors worked out very sophisticated answers to such questions. So worked out means sort of like figured out or came upon the answer through effort. So it was not obvious. They didn't discover it. They worked it out. Sophisticated answers to such questions. But we still don't understand them very well. So our ancestors answered the question, but we don't understand the answers. This is because they, meaning the answers, are in large part, so mostly, still implicit. So the answers are not clearly written down and expounded by philosophers. They are implicit, implied somewhere. They are implicit, manifest primarily in ritual and myth. So the answer to the question of meaning is implied in ritual and myth, not explicitly explained. And as of yet, incompletely articulated. So as of today, no one has clearly articulated what values are truly meaningful in an eternal, an overarching context. We act them out and represent them in stories, but we are not yet wise enough to formulate them explicitly. And I think last week I illustrated this by saying maybe we have a story of a person. Hold on one second. Okay, I believe that last week I illustrated this concept that we don't understand explicitly something, but we act it out, we recognize it in stories by saying something like this. We read a story of a hero who does something terribly, terribly dangerous in order to maybe save a child or something. And in a sense, what he has done is unwise and not expedient, and we would tell our children, do not do this. And yet, we can recognize in our heart that in this situation, he was a hero. Whereas if he did the same thing in another situation, it would be wrong. For example, I think about the men who went into the World Trade Center on 9/11, September 11th, when the World Trade Center buildings were on fire and were going to collapse, and you had a steady stream of people coming out, and you had a steady stream of firefighters and volunteers going in. They were going into a burning building to help, and they all died. And generally, you tell people, do not go into a burning building. But in this case, we all knew they were heroes. So you cannot write a rule book to say when it is time to do something crazy and be a hero. You can't write a rule book for that. For example, another example, maybe I said this last week. You see somebody drowning and you jump in to save them. We are always told, do not jump in to save someone who is drowning, because you will probably drown also. But if someone does it and manages to save the person, we recognize heroism. So in stories, we have encoded a sense of the heroic. And those heroes are usually doing things that people shouldn't do normally. But in this unique case, they were good for doing it. We cannot completely articulate what it means and how you should always behave, but we recognize it. So this is what he means by that the answers to the questions of meaning were worked out by our ancestors, but not completely articulated, and they are worked into stories and rituals. So we can appreciate them without fully understanding them in a way that we could define or fully articulate. So we are not yet wise enough to formulate these ideas explicitly. We are still chimps in a troop or wolves in a pack. He is talking about evolution. Chimpanzees are not as evolved as human beings. They act more on instinct than with higher level reasoning. Same with wolves. So, we know how to behave. That means we know how to act, much as wolves and chimps know how to act. But, so we know who's who, like who is in charge, and why. We've learned it through experience. Our knowledge has been shaped by our interaction with others. We've established a predictable routine and patterns of behavior, but we don't really understand them. So only through experience, like a child learns to respect his father and mother by interacting with them from birth. But he may not understand truly the why he owes them honor in the fullest sense. Okay, so we did go over this last week, so I don't want to take a lot of time. But anyway, we don't really understand these ruminations on higher meaning. We don't know where they originated. They've evolved over great expanses of time. This is Jordan Peterson's idea of evolution, which he spoke of in the first chapter, that our collective memory goes back before humanity ever evolved. That's his assertion. Great expanses of time. No one was formulating these ideas explicitly, at least not in the dimmest reaches of the past. Even though we've been telling each other how to act forever. So we tell people how to act just like a chimp or a wolf nurtures their young to teach them how to behave as a member of the group. But they are not writing treatises on it. And the same with human beings. We know how to act, we teach our children how to act, but we don't have a complete understanding. One day, However, not so long ago, maybe with the ancient Greek philosophers or the early writers of the Bible, we woke up. We were already doing, but we started noticing what we were doing. So he is talking about the evolution from something more like a chimpanzee to something more like a man with self-consciousness. We started using our bodies as devices to represent their own actions. We started imitating and dramatizing. So think of the ancient Greek dramas. They began to put on plays as a form of art and a form of communication. We invented ritual. Ritual is a symbolic act that symbolizes a non-material reality. Okay? Sort of like, for example, a dance can be a ritualization of romance and courtship. Okay, ritual. We started acting out our own experiences. Then we started to tell stories. So he is speculating this was all part of evolution. Eventually, a caveman started acting things out and telling stories and drawing on the wall stories. We coded our observations of our own drama in these stories. So that coding is how the greater understandings that we didn't fully understand became implicit in our mythology and in our ritual. In this manner, the information that was first only embedded in our behavior became represented in our stories. But we didn't and still don't understand what it all means. Now we move on. Okay, I think I'm going to say end 48 here. And I'll choose blue. Okay. Now he's going to give an example of a very early myth that embodies some of this meaningfulness, some of the information about transcendent value. So he goes to the Bible, the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, talking about the creation of the world. He was using this as an example of what he was talking about up here, about we evolved to where we became self-conscious and we began to tell stories, to reflect what we observe about the world and our own behavior. So he is asserting that the biblical story of creation is an example of man telling a story to symbolically represent what he observes in human behavior. That's what he's saying. The biblical narrative means story, of paradise and the fall. So this is the first 3 chapters, maybe 3 to 5 chapters, once he gets into Cain and Abel. The first 5 chapters, maybe, of the book of Genesis contains the biblical narrative of paradise, which is the Garden of Eden, and the fall, which is the first sin of man. Okay, so the biblical narrative of paradise and the fall is one such story. So it's a story like this. Fabricated by our collective imagination. Okay, I personally do not believe that the biblical account is fabricated. That means created by our collective imagination. I think that it is inspired by God and basically a true history of what Adam and Eve witnessed and what the early first people witnessed. I personally believe in Adam and Eve. And I think that God revealed details of creation to them. And then after that, they simply wrote down what they firsthand experienced in terms of the stories they record. So I don't believe this, but this is what he is saying. Okay. So he says this story was fabricated by the collective imagination of all mankind. So somehow people understood the world the same way and created this story to reflect it. So, fabricated by our collective imagination, working over the centuries. Oh, really? Okay, so I guess he is suggesting that perhaps it was an oral tale that people were telling around a campfire for hundreds and thousands of years until finally it was written down by Moses in its present form. I think that is probably what he is suggesting, that the story itself evolved over thousands of years around campfires. Okay? So this story, it provides a profound account of the nature of being. It really is an amazing story from a philosophical point of view. For an early first story of mankind. Okay. So, it provides a profound account of the nature of being and points the way to a mode of conceptualization and action well matched to that of nature. Well matched to that nature, sorry. So it points the way to a mode of conceptualization and action well matched to nature. Okay, so a mode of conceptualization is like a worldview that is well matched to what we can observe. And then it also points the way to a set of actions well matched to what we can observe. So whoever wrote it had an amazing insight into the way the cosmos works in conjunction with human nature and human thriving, how you can act in order to thrive in this universe that God, or that we find ourselves in. So this idea that was put forth in it matched the phenomenon very well. So here's the story. In the Garden of Eden, prior to the dawn of self-consciousness, so the dawn of self-consciousness is pictured in the story as the eating of a tree of knowledge. Previous to that, Adam and Eve were innocent. They had never sinned and they did not understand good and evil. So he is saying that's the dawn of consciousness before the dawn of consciousness. So from an evolutionary perspective, you would say that this was maybe before we evolved into fully self-conscious human beings, back when we were more like chimpanzees or something, apes. That would be our phase of innocence. But then somehow we evolved into full human beings with self-consciousness, and then we acquired somehow the knowledge of good and evil. And this is pictured in the story as sinning, falling from grace, eating from the tree of knowledge. So, in the Garden of Eden, prior to the dawn of self-consciousness, dawn means beginning. Sunrise symbolizes beginning. So goes the story. Human beings were sinless, innocent. Our primordial parents, Adam and Eve, primordial means so far back in time as to be impossible really to remember, sort of lost in the furthest reaches of the past, primordial. So Adam and Eve would be kind of like maybe the first Homo sapiens that evolved from some lower form of primate that was not fully human. So our primordial parents, Adam and Eve, walked with God. So that is the story. Before we became fully human, we were innocent, we were connected to God. Then, tempted by the snake, which is a symbol of evil, the first couple ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then they discovered death and vulnerability and turned away from God. And mankind was exiled from paradise and began its effortful mortal existence. So, prior to the dawn of self-consciousness is before we were fully Homo sapiens. Then we evolved into full human beings with the knowledge of good and evil, and that is pictured as a fall from ignorance and bliss. Ignorance is bliss. We say that in English. Ignorance is bliss. Well, we fell from that state by gaining knowledge, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now we know good and evil, and we are banished from our infantile connection to God. Now we're sort of set adrift in this world that we see today, and they saw when they were writing this, where it is hard to make a living, where life sucks, where you're going to die. Prior to this, there was no death. Maybe. Anyway, this is all pictured in the creation story very symbolically. The idea of sacrifice enters soon afterwards, beginning with the account of Cain and Abel. This is immediately after the fall of Adam and Eve, and they're kicked out of the garden and cursed with having to work hard against the elements in order to survive. Immediately after that is the story of their first two sons, Cain the eldest and Abel the younger, who both brought sacrifices to God. One brought like a lamb. The other brought produce of the garden. One was a farmer, the other was a herdsman. And Cain, the elder, was not received by God, and God rebuked him and said, "Be good and you will be acceptable." And Cain angrily went away. Instead of being good, he killed his brother Abel in anger, and then received more punishment from God. So, the idea of sacrifice enters the story soon after, with Cain and Abel bringing sacrifice, and developing through the Abrahamic adventures and the Exodus. So the idea of sacrifice is developed through the Abrahamic adventures and the Exodus. If you don't know about all of the history of Abraham, all of his adventures, you should finish the entire book of Genesis. It's not so long, you can read it. if you haven't already. And then if you want to read about the Exodus, the second book in the Bible is called Exodus. So if you read the first 2 books of the Bible, you will know about the Abrahamic adventures and the Exodus. And these things are real history. I think almost everybody these days concedes that there is real historical accuracy in these accounts. I could be wrong. Maybe some people don't, but I think most people do. Okay. After much contemplation, struggling humanity learns that God's favor could be gained and his wrath averted through proper sacrifice. And also that bloody murder might be motivated among those unwilling or unable to succeed in this manner by sacrifice. So it says, after much contemplation, he says he believes that the book of Genesis is actually the result of centuries of development. So lots of contemplation. They discover that you can make bargains with God, with something supernatural that will affect the cosmos. And that bargain can gain favors and avert wrath. And that it has something to do with proper sacrifice, because Cain and Abel both brought sacrifices. So what was the difference? There must be a difference, and if we can learn to be like Abel, then we'll have the favor of God. But if we do it like Cain, we'll be punished and cast out. And also, that if we don't figure out how to do it like Abel, and we keep getting rejected by God, we may become so angry that we kill our brothers and commit bloody murder, as Cain did. So all of this is embedded in the first 2 books of the Bible, and especially in the first stories of the Bible. Not fully understood, not fully explained, but symbolically represented in the form of a myth or a story. A very, very profound myth and story. And Jordan Peterson has a lot of teachings about the Bible that treat it in this way, that find deep psychological meaning in the stories of the Bible. So you can find his stuff online. I haven't seen it, so I don't know where, but I've heard that it's readily available. Okay, moving on. The delay of gratification. So everybody knows what delayed gratification is. If I know that maybe if I eat a lot of ice cream, I'm going to be fat. And I don't want to be fat. I want to be skinny in the future. So I will put away the immediate pleasure of the ice cream for the later pleasure of being skinny. I am delaying my gratification. I'm going to be gratified by being skinny later instead of by enjoying food now. So the delay of gratification. This is not characteristic of animals. It's mainly characteristic of human beings. Okay. When engaging in sacrifice, our forefathers began to act out what would be considered a proposition if it were stated in words. So remember we said they were going to act out through stories and rituals and myths, implicit ideas of transcendent reality. And so this is when they were doing sacrifices, they were doing that. They were using their body as a vehicle to enact or to actually act out actions that were symbolic of sacrifices that would reconcile you to God. So the proposition that they were acting out is something better might be attained in the future by giving up something of value in the present. So here he has fully articulated the value which is implied by the action, implicit in the action, implied by the action. So something better might be attained in the future by giving up something of value in the present. Recall, if you will, that the necessity for work is one of the curses placed by God upon Adam and his descendants in consequence of original sin. Adam's waking to the fundamental constraints of his being, so Adam's waking up to his vulnerability, to his limitations, to the fact that if he wanted to eat and stay alive, he would have to work and fight with the thorns and thistles of the ground. His discovery of the world as we know it, this is what happened at the fall, when the dawn of consciousness, okay, when he became fully human, he understood that he had to do this. All right. His waking to the fundamental constraints of his being, his vulnerability, his eventual death, is equivalent to his discovery of the future. Okay, so most animals don't have an orientation of future and past. Most animals sort of live in the present. And human beings, with our understanding of the future, we are unique in that. It says this is part of the dawn of consciousness, the dawn of understanding the world we live in, and that we will have to work in order to stay alive, came with it an understanding of future as well as present and past. The future, that's where you go to die. Hopefully not too soon. Your demise, that means your death, might be staved off, delayed, through work, through the sacrifice of the now to gain benefit later. Okay, so work equals sacrificing now to gain a benefit later. So if I work now, then I can buy food and eat and live. So I can buy food and later eat it and live. So working is a sacrifice of my time in the present so that I will live in the future to be able to eat. It is for this reason, among others, no doubt. So when he says this, he means this is not the only reason, but this is one of the reasons, okay? That the concept of sacrifice is introduced in the biblical chapter immediately following the drama of the fall. Okay, so work is part of the fall. Future is part of the fall. And sacrifice is the symbol of work and future, and this is the nature of our cosmos, that we must work toward the future in order to stay alive. And that whole reality is embodied in the ritual of sacrifice. So the Bible story, the biblical story, brings about the concept of sacrifice immediately after the fall, because with the fall, you become alive to the necessity of work and the future, and that is symbolized in the ritual of sacrifice. All right. There is little difference between sacrifice and work. They are also both uniquely human. So animals don't sacrifice and animals don't actually work. That's what he's saying. Sometimes animals act as if they are working. So they sort of look like they are working, but they are really only following the dictates of their own nature. Beavers build dams. They do so because they are beavers, and beavers build dams. They don't think, yeah, but I'd rather be on a beach in Mexico with my girlfriend while they're doing it. So beavers are not working toward the future in the same way we do as a sacrifice. Beavers follow their instinct and do it. And they're not thinking, I'll do this now so that I can have a vacation later with my girlfriend. They don't think that way. Animals don't think that way. They just do it. We think that way. We consciously realize that I must delay gratification. I must work now in order to enjoy later. Prosaically, that means just speaking plainly, such sacrifice work is delay of gratification. So just to put it plainly, work equals delayed gratification. Sacrifice equals delayed gratification. But that's a very mundane phrase to describe something of such profound significance. The discovery that gratification could be delayed was simultaneously the discovery of time, and with it, causality, at least the causal force of voluntary human action. So it's not just, oh, they discovered they could delay gratification. It's they discovered time, future, past, present, and they discovered causality. If I do this, this will happen. Now, animals do have a sense of causality. But I guess he's saying this is back in the dawn of time when people were evolving these understandings. Long ago, in the dim mists of time, we began to realize that reality was structured as if it could be bargained with. So long ago, primordial times, we observed that it was possible to do something to affect maybe the weather, maybe the growth of crops, maybe the success of a hunt, etc., etc. It became possible to appease the gods and gain favor somehow. We learned that behaving properly now in the present, regulating our impulses, considering the plight of others, could bring rewards in the future, in a time and place that did not yet exist. Okay, so I know many ancient cultures used to do all sorts of things to try to secure a good crop or something. But I believe it was just the Jews who discovered that you should consider the plight of others as part of it. I think that is very Jewish. But anyway, we began to inhibit, control, and organize our immediate impulses so that we could stop interfering with other people and our future selves. Interfering with other people is like hurting someone. For example, most animals will take a female anytime they want. You see a female, you want to mate with her, you can just mate with her. But human beings can't do that without devastating consequences. So we had to regulate our impulses, regulate, inhibit, control, and organize our immediate impulses so that we could stop interfering with other people, like her brothers and her father, or her husband. That would be taking her sexually would bother those people. And it would also affect our future selves. If you just took any woman, you'd end up with children everywhere, and in your future, you'd be crazy. Everything would be bad. So we learned that we needed to inhibit, control, and organize our immediate impulses so that we could stop interfering with other people and our own future selves. Doing so was indistinguishable from organizing society. So we learned to organize our own, and at the same time we organized society. The discovery of the causal relationship between our efforts today and the quality of tomorrow motivated the social contract. So the social contract at its most basic is, I don't kill you, you don't kill me. We have a mutual pact to not kill each other. Then it could become a little more complex. I will not take your stuff, and you will not take my stuff. And then, it can continue to be more and more complex. The social contract. The 10 Commandments is a very good early statement of the social contract which organizes societies. Okay, so there's a causal relationship between our efforts today and the quality of tomorrow, and this motivated the social contract, which the idea is human beings observed themselves behaving in these ways to avoid making everyone else angry. And then they began to put it into plays and rituals and sacrifices before God and etc. Okay, so it also motivated the social contract, which is like a creation of law, common law, a body of rules of behavior. So the social contract, which is the organization that enables today's work to be stored reliably, mostly in the form of promises from others. So today's work, we are sacrificing today to work so that in the future we will get a benefit. So how can we be sure our work today will bring us the benefit? Well, mostly we must extract promises from one another. So money is a form of a promise. When I do a certain amount of work, I receive money, which I can then exchange for the benefit later. It's a promise that when you give that piece of paper back, someone will give you the benefit. So their contracts are promises. Okay. I think we need to stop there because we're about out of time and this next paragraph is really long. So let's go ahead and stop right here. So this is the end of 49. And we will pick it up next week. See you later.